Hello, my name's Lawrence Dawkins-Hall, and I'm here in my capacity as an applicant support mentor to talk a little bit about professional registration, and in particular, the how and why. I think by implication, what I won't be talking about today, but I'll revisit this, is what you actually need to do in terms of specifics to fill out the competency form. So essentially, this talk is really an introductory talk on the benefits and the actual mechanics of applying for professional registration. So I mentioned the fact that my name's Lawrence Dawkins-Hall. Before I go any further, let me preface what I'm going to say. We're talking a little bit about my credentials, which in effect sort of explain why I'm here. So I am actually a chartered scientist myself. In addition, I'm also not just a member of the Institute of Science and Technology, which is one of the licensed bodies of the Science Council. I'm actually a fellow, and the reason I'm a fellow is because I work actively on behalf of the IST as I do the Science Council. For example, giving works similar to this. And in addition, and this is crucial for aftercare that I can provide, I'm also an assessor for both the Science Council and the IST. That has implications for you in two ways. One is that I'm obviously aware of what constitutes competency answers, as I call them, but also it means that I can actually mentor you beyond this presentation. So where you're concerned and I'm concerned, our respective mutual journey, consider this the beginning of the journey rather than the end. So I will prime you with this talk, and subsequently, if you want to ask me any questions regarding what I'm going to talk about, and in addition, anything to do with aspects of the competency form in terms of filling it in, drop me a line at either my Science Council email address or even my Twitter account. The other thing I'd say is if you have any general questions about professional registration, talk to Hayley McNeil at the Science Council, either through her personal address or through this address here. Hayley is the Senior Professional Registration Officer at the Science Council, and I refer to Hayley as the gatekeeper of registration. She's the person in the know. She has all the right contacts, so she can answer any general queries you have. The only other thing I'm going to say before I depart this slide is this is actually a link to the Common Application Portal. The Common Application Portal, as I'll elaborate on today, is actually the place where you submit your application. It's rooted in SurveyMonkey, and this is actually a hyperlink to the place where you commence your registration. So I would say to you before moving on to the next slide, maybe drop me a line at the very least to obtain a copy of this talk. And in addition, you might want to obtain a copy of this talk because throughout this presentation, I give you hyperlinks to significant and pertinent material where registration is concerned. So a little bit about me, apart from the fact that I'm an applicant support mentor for the Science Council. So I'm a biomedical scientist by background. I'm a scientist with 30 years experience that's worked all over the UK. I think crucially, as I've already pointed out, your point of view, I'm a review editor, I'm an assessor, and I'm also an assessor for the Science Council and the IST where registration is concerned, as I've already pointed out. So if we look at a synopsis of this talk and try and sort of drill down a little bit, what we're going to talk about is the benefits of registration. Why would you do it? Then we're going to move on to the mechanics of applying itself, the actual dealing with the interface of CAP, the Common Application Process, the way that you put in your application via the Science Council portal. Compiling evidence, okay, how do you actually, useful tips for actually going about compiling continuous professional development or CPD, which you feed into your competency report. The other thing that I'll touch upon is there are three main registers apart from CSci Teach pertaining to professional registration. There's RSci Tech, RSci and CSci. So one of the things I'll talk about is the experience that's commensurate with each register. And I think by implication, that should give you an idea of which register you should pitch for. Then, as I've said before, this isn't a detailed talk about competencies, but of course, I'll go into a little bit about what they are. Before moving on, though, I just want to sort of elaborate on the fact that I have, as an applicant support mentor, I have my own profile on the Science Council website, and I've given you actually a link to that profile here. The talk I'm going to give today is essentially synonymous with a workshop I provide in a different series on professional registration for the Science Council, an introduction. But also, as I've alluded to at the beginning, in my first slide, I give bespoke talks on how to actually go about filling in the competency forms for both the lower two registers, RSci and RSci Tech, and CSci. So either gain this talk in order to sort of log on to those, because they'll give you useful tips in terms of the sorts of materials you might want to populate your own competency forms with. Okay, so they're actually quite useful to look at. The other thing I'll mention in passing is these talks have been given hitherto as part of a professional registration workshop series, and that actually is continuing up to December. So I would contact Jane Banks if you're interested in actually attending either the introductory talk, which essentially is synonymous with this, or perhaps therefore the part twos, the more specialist competency compiling talks. So before I talk about the benefits of registration, I thought it might be useful just to actually define what registration is and why it's necessary. So professional registration is independent accreditation of your skills, or as they're referred to in Science Council parlance, competencies. Okay, so it's independent validation of your skills. The other thing I'd say with regard to professional registration, this sets it apart from an academic qualification, is it looks at you holistically. So there are 5 canonical competencies, as we'll touch upon later in the talk, and they look at all aspects of your job, not just your technical knowledge and practice, but also things like your time management, your problem solving skills, your communication skills. So it looks at you holistically. In other words, your ability to proficiently and with aptitude actually carry out your job, which sets it apart from an academic qualification. So in that regard, professional registration is a technical award that's awarded much in the same way as chartered engineering is awarded by the Engineering Council. Why has that been necessary? Well, I think it's fair to say, and this is definitely true of the academic sector in particular, is historically there's been an absence of accreditation for technicians translating into a substantive career pathway. And professional registration is one aspect of a wider remit to address, or rather redress, that problem for technicians. It's part of something called the technician commitment. If you think about it, in many industries, higher academic qualifications, and especially a PhD, are what actually translate into some sort of substantive and meaningful career path. That hasn't been true thus far of technicians. And really, professional registration is a scheme to sort of plug that hole, if you like. Professional registration awarded by the Science Council through a series of licensed bodies. There are currently 34, including ASPIH. As I've mentioned before, there are 3 actual registers, RSci Tech, RSci, and CSci. There is another CSci Teach, but that isn't really the subject of today's talk, as that is really pertinent to classroom secondary school teachers. So what are the benefits of registration? You accredit your skills, but in terms of what it might do for you, what are the principal benefits? Well, the first thing, which is sort of self-evident, is validation of skills. And that leads to recognition amongst your peers. And that in itself is no bad thing. As a result of that, it's a confidence building exercise. The thing about professional registration, as I've alluded to its raison d'etre, is the fact that as institutions, as more and more people within institutions become professionally registered, it will actually have an impact on your career development, okay? And by that I mean that when a certain number of people within those institutions have been professionally registered, it could be, and this is increasingly happening, for example, in government funded institutions, it could be that if you are professionally registered, you might be considered preferentially over and above someone who isn't for promotion. Regardless, consider it part of your CPD, okay? Look at the competencies, think about what you need to do in terms of actually fulfilling those competencies, and make that part of your appraisal with your line manager. Build it into your CPD. I've sort of touched upon the fact in terms of career development that if you're professionally registered today, that may have impact outside your own organization in terms of job prospects. As I've said, many of the government funded institutes are actually looking more favorably upon candidates who have professional registration in terms of accelerated career development. And so I think it's fair to say, and by implication, if you go for a job at one of those institutes, such as the MRC or other government funded institutes, you're likely to be looked upon more favorably in terms of not only if you just get the job, but even if you actually get as far as interview, if you are professionally registered. Over and above an academic qualification, it obviously gives you something extra. The other thing that professional registration can do as a tangible benefit, and I speak here autobiographically, is it can actually lead to developments outside the workplace, some of which are voluntary, but actually can lead on, for example, to paid work. So you network with like-minded individuals, and that gives you opportunities to speak at conferences such as myself. The other thing it may do is it actually here and there might actually lead to some paid opportunities. For example, if you take myself, I'm an applicant support mentor. That is a freelance arrangement with the Science Council, and that came about as a result of networking and becoming a chartered scientist myself. So it isn't just about accelerated promotion within the context of your day job and actually facilitating you obtaining a job outside. It can lead to opportunities outside the workplace, paid and unpaid. Don't take my word for it. So there are many, many things, positive affirmations of professional registration for the sorts of reasons I've given. But if we look at 3 candidates who are members of the Institute of Biomedical Sciences, and we look at registration is a great opportunity for research technicians to be nationally recognized by their colleagues and peers. A registered scientist at RSI said that being a registered scientist has improved my professional status and career progression. And finally, the CSI candidate talks about the fact that becoming a CSI has actually opened up opportunities through networking outside their actual workplace. So if we think about the mechanics of applying for professional registration, this is really a schematic of how you go about it. So the first thing you need to do is decide which register is right for you. And hopefully, if I do my job well today, you shall have some idea. So are you RSI Tech, RSI or CSI? Choose which assessment route to take. There's face-to-face interview, or more commonly the written route. And I'll talk about the benefits and potential disadvantages of both, although it's very much a personal fit. Consider examples of meeting your competencies, and in that regard, how you go about compiling your evidence, your CPD, for those competencies. Finally, select the professional body which is right for you to join. And then, having done all of that, go through the common application process itself, CAP, using the link at the beginning of my talk, or a number of subsidiary links on the Science Council website itself. So before I say anything else, there is a lot of material on professional registration that will guide you both in terms of preparing and then actually going through CAP itself. This is the actual link to CAP. This is basically a link here, which gives you general support on the Science Council website. There is an associated excellent video, which I'd encourage you to read. This walks you step by step. It's a YouTube video, and it's also on the Science Council website in terms of completing your competency report. The sort of thing that I actually do in my part 2 talks more than today, okay? I'm prepared to actually give you a link to my own competency report, and I have one for RSci and CSci. This is a link to my RSci one. If you want my CSci, you can drop me a line at my Science Council email address. Many of the societies, including ASPIH, but also IST, actually have a lot of support material to actually clue up candidates who are thinking of applying for professional registration. Okay, so not only the Science Council website, but the actual associated licensed bodies have their own materials guiding registrants through the process. Okay, and this link here is from the Science Council website, and it's the sort of thing I'm going to recapitulate today in my talk, which basically takes you step by step from how do I start all the way to how is my application assessed. And essentially this is synonymous with much of what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, deciding which register is right for you. Okay, so the first thing I'll say is I've provided you with a link to an actual questionnaire, a very, very good questionnaire that the Science Council allows you to walk through based on a series of questions and answers that should give you an idea of whether you're RSci, RSci Tech, or CSci. But in terms of deciding which register is right for you, okay, walk through this process here, but also reflect on your own experience, okay? Work through the self-help materials that I've mentioned from the societies, including this questionnaire here. Ask Science Council mentors for suggestions. And that goes back to what I said on the first. If you're not sure about which register is right for you, having gone through these materials, drop me a line. And if you show me your CV, if you're prepared to show me your CV, I'm particularly adept now at looking at experience and making a suggestion as to which register you might want to pitch for. What I'd say is before you actually commence CAP, make sure you can meet the competencies. And in that regard, there's 2 further points I'd make. If necessary, implement a CPD plan of action to fully meet your criterion. Remember, this is not a time assessed event, okay? It's not an assessment. If you want to spend 6 months actually putting together in association with your line manager steps that you need to take to fulfill multiple aspects of the 5 canonical competencies that I've mentioned, then do that, okay? It's better that you do that and then apply than wing it a little bit and apply, because it'll just get bounced back to you. So if we talk a little bit more about levels of experience versus the actual 3 principal registers I've mentioned. So in essence, as an RSci Tech, you would be expected to perform at level 3 or 4. In everyday parlance, that's A levels. For an RSci, you would be expected to perform at level 5 and 6. In other words, perform in your job in terms of skills and knowledge sets at a level that's commensurate with an HND or a degree. Finally, for CSci, you're expected to perform at a level that's commensurate with a master's degree or perhaps even a PhD. The thing I want to make clear is, and this is the beauty of professional registration, the way it's set up, is you don't actually need the formal qualifications, okay? It is the equivalent experience that is paramount. So don't worry if you don't have a degree or a master's. If you can demonstrate that through your competency report, through your work experience, it's that ultimately leads to the award. You won't be precluded because you don't have a degree. It's about what you do in the day. I will, however, make one caveat in that regard, and that practice is equivalent to experience, but as of next year, if you don't have the formal qualifications, in addition to the formal competency report, you will be asked to submit an additional report called an equivalency report. Now, as it happens, I'm a CSI who doesn't have a master's. So I'm a CSI with a degree. I came in at level 6. So I was obliged to actually put together this supplementary document called an equivalency report. And so once again, I make the offer that if you're not sure, in addition to what to do in terms of nuances as to how you actually complete your competency form, if you can do that or not, but you stumble on your equivalency report, which some people do, drop me a line and I can help you, because I've gone through the actual process. But in terms of background information, I provided a link here to a new and very comprehensive document that the Science Council has put together quite recently. So just to reiterate, if you're going for CSI with a bachelor's, in other words, you don't have a level 7, if you go between now and December, you will need to submit an equivalency report for CSI. For RSci and RSci Tech, if you thought about commencing your application before Christmas, that's not necessary. You just need to actually talk a little bit more about your skills in your competency report, so-called extended competency answers. And once again, I can help you there. From the new year, however, Hayley McNeil, who I've mentioned at the beginning, has informed me that for RSci Tech and RSci, in addition to CSI, you will be required to submit this separate document. So take a look at that if you don't actually have the formal qualifications. But let me stress, they're not an actual prohibition to obtaining one of the 3 registers. It's all about your skills and how you perform your day job. Okay, enough about that. Let's try and talk in more detail about what you're expected to do or perform as it vis-a-vis the 3 registers. Okay, well, I've mentioned the fact that as an RSci Tech, you would be expected to perform at level 3, A-level standards, okay? And what that actually means in practice is that you're probably 1 year into lab work. In other words, you're not completely helpless. You're not a rookie. You're able to actually carry out prescribed procedures, standard operating procedures, SOP, independently, okay, without someone actually standing over your shoulder. That said, as an RSci Tech, you may do it, but you wouldn't necessarily be expected to actually problem solve. The other thing as an RSci Tech that you're not expected to do is to train others. So really, as an RSci Tech, you're collaborating extensively with your supervisor. You're being led by your supervisor, but in terms of your day-to-day bench work, you can actually perform that competently and independently. So before I move on to RSci, actually, this was something I wanted to show for RSci Tech, but it equally applies to the other registers. So the thing about the Science Council website is it's very, very comprehensively set up. So if you look at these main headings here, you can actually see that you have different menus which enable you to think about your level of registration and the actual mechanics of applying, okay, and even how much it's going to cost. And the thing to notice is, apart from a catch-all portal that I'll show you in a minute, for each of the individual registers, you can apply directly from this page. And the other thing to note is the fact that below the application portal, in this case for RSci Tech, but each of the registers has a page like this on the Science Council website, you've also got a lot of guidance in terms of how to actually complete the competency report itself. So take a look at these documents on the Science Council webpage once you've decided which register you think you fit. And in the case of RSci Tech, I've given you a link to that material there. If we move on to RSci, as I've mentioned, this is someone performing at a level that's commensurate with an HND level 5 or a degree. So what are the seminal differences between an RSci and an RSci Tech? Well, essentially, an RSci is an experienced RSci Tech. What does that mean in prosaic terms? What it means is they have 2 or more years experience, such that not only can they work independently, they're actually able to problem solve, troubleshoot. So if you contrast that for a second with an RSci Tech, they will basically practice their experiments competently within a prescribed SOP. And if they encounter a problem, they will refer that back to somebody more experienced in the lab. However, for an RSI, you would be expected, using your additional knowledge and experience, to actually come up with strategies, troubleshoot, problem solve what the problem is, and maybe find an experimental solution. The other seminal difference between an RSI and an RSI tech is, by virtue of extra experience, you might be training others, okay? So you're not just accountable for your own personal bench work in association with your supervisor, your line manager. You may be training other students. And that training won't just take the form of technical training. In association with that, and in addition to that, it might involve health and safety training that of course is an integral part of any sort of experimental procedure in a lab today. Finally, let's talk about CSI. So a CSI is a little bit different to an RSI and an RSI tech. An RSI is really a continuation of RSI tech, whereas a CSI is a slightly different beast. What do I mean by that? Well, you mentioned the fact that for a CSI at the moment, you're expected to be qualified to master's level, or if not, as of this moment in time, to submit this separate equivalency report that I can help you with if this basically fits you. But I think crucially, a CSI is somebody who won't just be training others, they'll be supervising others. That's a so-called lab manager. You'll also get more senior CSIs who are line manager, and they may be responsible for running teams and actually looking at the overall performance of the lab. They're more likely to be involved in budgetary applications as well, and in procuring equipment purchases, for example. But I want to make one thing clear that basically threw me off the scent when I first applied. So 3 years ago, I applied for an RSI, and for a CSI, you need 5 years experience. So 3 years ago, I applied for an RSI with something like 25 years experience. Well, why would I do that, given that the threshold is 5 years experience and furthermore, the right sort of experience? I have to stress that. Well, it was the fact that I didn't have manager in my job title. And it was made clear to me by Hayley McNeil's equivalent at the Science Council that as long as you're supervising somebody, it's not what your job title says you are, it's what you're doing. So I may not have been managing teams, but I was managing students. I was supervising students. So let's basically look at the dichotomy between training and supervision if you're not a line manager. If you are training somebody to carry out an experiment and they then go away and perform the experiment and you have no further input, that's synonymous with training. That's basically within the realms of RSI. Contrast that with somebody that has a student that doesn't just train them in relevant techniques and associated health and safety. They also actually look at the data they generate and they actually design new experiments. So they're taking them through the whole project pipeline in order to basically generate the data, interpret the data, and decide what experiments need to be done next in order to accrete that data. That's supervision. And even if you're not a line manager, that means you are eligible to apply for CSI. And I've just put a link here to basically details of the CSI award and associated competencies, responsibilities, etc. So have a look at that link. If you're still in doubt, there is this general matrix. And what I'd say about the matrix is it gives you a good overview of the magnitude of responsibility vis-a-vis the 5 competencies that we haven't really touched upon yet, but I will just for a second. Okay. But it may not help you decide exactly how that translates into what you put in. So I would encourage you all to look at this matrix and then basically reflect upon what you've done. And if you're not sure how the statements in this matrix translate into specific case studies or examples for you to populate your competency form, as I say, drop me a line. Okay. So let me mention in passing, it's not really the subject of today's talk, If you're interested in specifics, as I say, drop me a line, look at my part 2 talks, depending on which register you think you are. But I'll mention in passing that, as I've said, the competencies are designed to address your proficiency in all aspects of your job. So for example, A really is about talking shop. This is where you talk about how you practice your job technically. So if we look at, say, an RSI tech, they basically interpret and evaluate data, okay? Whereas an RSI would apply their knowledge in the context of new areas, okay? A CSI, it's a broader remit, okay? They use their specialist knowledge and broader understanding, okay, to come up with solutions and perhaps new ways of doing things, all right? If we say take a look at B, that's personal responsibility. So that's about how you work, how you manage your time. So as I've said at the beginning, when I defined the 3 registers, an RSI tech is someone that works with minimal supervision, but is subject to somebody with more experience to guide them. An RSI, by contrast, works autonomously, problem solves and takes responsibility for safe working practices, and that may extend to training others, okay? And then similarly, there's a much broader remit for a CSI, okay? They implement health and safety solutions, they develop new solutions, they exercise responsibility for their own work and the work of others, okay? C is interpersonal skills. So this is really how you communicate. And obviously, the further you go from RSI Tech to RSI, the more constituent groups you talk to, and that has a bearing on how you talk to them. Professional practice is about recognizing problems, participate in continuous development for RSI Tech. Registered scientist, it would be about identifying, reviewing, and selecting techniques and procedures and methods, maybe to overcome a problem, which as an RSI tech you wouldn't. With a CSI, in terms of professional practice, you might be responsible for scoping, planning, and managing projects. There is people's work, but also looking at consumables and finding the best consumables in terms of science, but also price, okay? Project planning, scoping a project, okay? And doing that similarly for updates and performances in the lab. Professionalism is really about CPD, so I won't talk about that in any sort of detail. And if you're interested, and I encourage you to look at this, if you're interested in accessing where this matrix is as a starting point for your actual own application, I've given you a link to it on the Science Council page there. Okay. So this really puts a little bit more detail on the matrix itself. So what I've done here is I've actually, I've delineated responsibilities for RSI and CSI in blue versus responsibilities that RSI and CSI, but also RSI techs. And this here is actually a video that I made reference to in terms of resources. That's a very, very good video that walks you through. It's just over 5 minutes long, and it walks you through how to actually go about filling out your competency form. So if we just recapitulate what has been said, for A, for example, for an RSI tech, you would practice, but you wouldn't necessarily troubleshoot, which you would for an RSI or a CSI, okay? In terms of personal responsibility, you are responsible for your own lab practice, okay, your own time management. Whereas an RSI and a CSI, in addition to that, they are responsible for training and supervising others. Stock taking and ordering and health and safety is obviously a ubiquitous aspect of any lab practice and is therefore basically pertinent to all 3 registers. If we look at interpersonal skills, who you liaise with, who you communicate with. So as an RSI tech, you may be liaising with medical reps. And the reason for doing that is because you are actually responsible perhaps for certain pieces of equipment that you actually use in your experiments. Labs today are very much unlike school chemistry labs. It isn't about glassware. It's about complicated pieces of equipment, both in a lab and outside a lab. Okay. So you'd be responsible for using that equipment. Okay. And you would maybe liaise with certain people that are responsible for basically fixing that equipment or service contracts, for example. However, that equipment, it would be the higher registers, the RSI and the CSI, that would liaise with the engineers if the equipment went wrong. And, for example, liaise with finance in terms of general responsibility, okay, scoping projects, as we've mentioned, all right. Professional practice. You can talk, for example, in the context of RSI Tech about implementing SOPs, but you wouldn't necessarily be expected to devise them and train others. That's the preserve of the high registers in blue. Okay. Consumables auditing is something that's likely to be done by an RSI or maybe a CSI. Workspace reorganization and outreach projects, these are associated with the higher registers, whereas planning your own work, okay, is something that all three registers do. Improvements in practice, that is something that applies there again to RSI Tech in terms of following prescribed procedures, but in a more general sense to the higher registers. Finally, as I've said, professionalism is really about complying with standards and your own personal CPD. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the different registers. So written or face-to-face, okay? So the written one is one that tends to be favored by most people, okay? So you're free to reflect and write at leisure. The disadvantage of the written competency report is that if you submit that report to an assessor like myself, and there are actually, if some of the competencies are wanting, then that report will be bounced back to you to amend, okay? And then you have to resubmit it. So there's inevitable time delay. If we actually contrast that with face-to-face, the disadvantage of face-to-face is you have to actually, Hayley McNeil tends to organize assessors like myself to carry out those sorts of assessments, okay? And some of the licensed bodies, like, for example, the IST, don't actually perform them. Some do, some don't. So there's less availability, less scope to carry out a face-to-face assessment. I think the major significant advantage of a face-to-face assessment, as I can speak to from experience, is the fact that if your competency report, you actually submit an abridged version of a written report compared to the full written report prior to your interview, if that in any way is lacking, then the assessors will actually drill down into the shortcomings. And if they're satisfied that in your interview answers, you've made up for some of the lackings in your written report, then they are in a position to award you the RSI, CSI, RSI Tech, whichever register it is. So face-to-face can be more daunting, but it's quicker, even with shortcomings in your competency report, okay? Consider examples of meeting your competencies. So what I've done here is I've provided a link to CPD tips. And CPD essentially is acquiring the skills that you need in order to complete your competency report. So there's some basically handy hints there. And there's another link I've given you here. Okay. So what I would say is it's always a good idea to compile examples of skills pertaining to those 5 competencies, okay, in real time. And that's simply because if you do it in real time, it'll be clear in your mind. It will also mean that you've got all the information to hand when you feel you're in a position to actually go ahead with CAP. So think of examples, 5 to 10 examples. And what I'd say is break your examples down. So apply your knowledge, personal responsibility. And really what that means is the fact that the competency form registration is designed to actually elucidate or illustrate different aspects, different skill sets such as communication, as well as technical skills and technical knowledge, which is really the preserved academic qualifications. In terms of keeping a log, there actually is a professional registration handbook that's quite well structured. And so if you actually obtain this handbook, and I'll show you a link in a second, you can talk about how you actually go about planning the acquisition of information that you will then use to populate your competency form. That can be meetings with your line manager. It can be part of your appraisal for things to discuss and presumably do. And this is just an example in the book of basically reflecting on something you've done. I supervised A-level students. So this is keeping a log of information that you'll subsequently use to populate a particular competency. And if you want a copy of that digital handbook, I've provided a link here. So what I'd say is you can use one competency example to create a single narrative linking the sub-competencies. Each competency is broken down into sections, okay? So you can basically recontextualize one example for different competencies and subsections thereof. That's using one theme to address multiple competencies, or conversely, you can actually use different examples for each of your competencies. Remember as well to think laterally, think outside the box, okay? So don't just focus on lab duties. I can't stress enough that this is about your holistic skill set, okay? It's not just about technical practice. So for example, if you are involved in gender equality, equality and diversity, Athena Swan, technician commitment, communication type things, these are all examples, for example, of things that you could use to populate, in this case, competencies C, interpersonal skills, and D, professional practice. Okay. And I've given you there again a link to a competency report planner. So these are some examples of CPD tips, what you need to do to actually compile your CPD, okay, which are examples of competencies in real time, okay. Step outside your comfort zone. As I say, I've mentioned the fact that in order to complete your competencies and to actually commence CAP, make sure you're ready. So if you feel that there are things you need to do, talk to your line manager, okay, be brave, okay, have conversations that allow you to do additional things that will bolster your competency report. And in that regard, have a conversation with your line manager, stay in contact, involve him in the whole thing, tell him about professional registration and the Science Council if he or she doesn't know. Keep a log of your activities. Don't see CPD as a box ticking exercise. And by that, I mean, and I'm saying this in the context of CPD versus competencies. So many people think that CPD is just about attending conferences and saying, I've done it. Think about why you're attending conferences, how they actually help, for example, you perform your job technically. That pertains to competency A, but there's so much more as we've talked about or touched upon in terms of competencies B, C, D, and E. Okay. So I've talked a little bit about competencies and how you would go about compiling them. I think the seminal take-home message is do it in real time. But where do you take your examples in order to populate your competency form and commence CAP? Okay. Generally speaking, take them from the last 5 years. That said, many contracts in science are time limited, okay? So if you've changed positions in 5 years, then take them from 2 jobs. This is something I did. I took competencies examples from my current position 3 years ago. I also looked back to another job. And one reason for doing that is to actually be, if you like, okay, to be pragmatic. It could be that a former job exemplifies examples of one competency more than another. So basically mix and match examples from, say, 2 jobs. If you're going to do that, however, make sure that you actually provide references for your 2 respective jobs. And what I'd say is that the default on CAP is one reference. That said, if you contact Hayley McNeil explaining that you'd like to actually populate your competency form from 2 jobs, then drop Hayley a line at the email I showed on the beginning slide, and she has said she will make provision for a second referee. Okay. The one other thing I'd say in this regard is it's about work in a professional environment. So that can include an intercalated year as part of your degree. Say for an RSci Tech, you're working in a lab professionally. So that could constitute your year of professional experience. In other words, having completed your degree, you don't have to wait a year. You can draw on your intercalated year. The other thing is that if you've worked in a professional environment, a lab or wherever, you haven't been paid, that's immaterial. What's important is what you've done. So that 5-year span can include voluntary work if that's required. Select which professional body you want to join. We're talking in the context of today's conference about the ASPIH, but it might also be, for example, the IST. And Sam McCormack has pointed out to me that the ISPIH is eligible under Science Council rules to award RSci and RSci Tech. But if you want a CSci, you're better off, say, with IST. Okay. And the only other point I'd make is the level of membership. So for an RSci Tech and an RSci, associate membership with that licensed body will suffice. Whereas for a CSci, you should probably pitch for full membership. Okay. So the Common Application Portal, okay, this is the actual place, the interface on the Science Council website where you'll commence your application. And if you go to the link I've provided here and on the first slide, what you'll see is you have an actual portal for all 3 registers. Having clicked on the one you think is appropriate, it essentially asks you to submit a user profile. So personal details, a little bit about your present job, some background information in terms of a full CV, any qualifications, and also vocational certificates, because after all, this is about skill accreditation. Upload your vocational certificates. Finally, the competency report itself. Okay. And what I'd say as we sort of near the end of this talk is CAP itself is very, very good as a real-time aid. What do I mean by that? Well, you get these bootstrapped statements actually sort of illuminating not just the competency, but the sub-competency thereof. So this is A2, the second sub-competency of technical knowledge. And it basically defines what that is. But if you're still not sure, during real-time application, you can click on this link on CAP and it will take you back to the sorts of material that I illustrated with that slide linked to RSci Tech, which gives you a series of PDFs, including extended competency report and other types of guidance. So there's actually guidance in real time when you're actually completing the competency report itself, completing CAP. Okay, so in terms of how you actually go about compiling answers, what I'd say is this is your opportunity to shine. This is about you. So make sure that you talk about teams, talk about what you've personally done. In other words, make sure that the pronoun I is replete and you don't talk about we. It's got to be your personal contribution, okay? Don't be too brief, okay? Outline a problem. Talk about the solution you selected and why. Being too brief and lacking depth is probably the main reason that assessors like myself bounce back competency reports to candidates via Hayley and say, not enough information. This is another one, no outcomes, okay? So it's not enough to talk about identifying a problem or a situation and talking about the solution or the practice you've used to actually carry that out. You've got to talk about results, okay? Did what you carried out solve the problem or address the situation? And I would say be careful about selecting examples where you can fulfill the brief in terms of what you've done, how you've done it, and why you've done it, but when there's no palpable solution, say, to a problem. So select examples with outputs, with outcomes, okay? Finally, not referencing the heading. that refers that each competency has a subcompetency, and there are subtle differences between them. If you want to know more about this, take a look at my part 2 talks or attend one of them in the upcoming Science Council workshops, okay? Because it's very easy to confuse, for example, A2 with A3. So think about how you populate the competencies as mentioned. So if I was to sum up this slide before I come to the end of the talk, I'd say there's a lovely acronym I've come across, STAR, situation, task, action, result, okay? Make sure that you incorporate all of those tenets into what I would call a competent competency answer. Okay. So this is just what will happen when you finish your report. Okay. So it's assessed by 2 assessors. That's to make sure that work independently and there isn't a bias. Okay. All right. The decision can take anything from 3 weeks to 2 months. It's 3 weeks if the assessors concur. And generally speaking, and I say this as someone who's assessed for 3 years, if you have a very strong report that is glowing in terms of one assessor, then the second assessor tends to follow suit. In that case, it comes back to you in probably about a month, according to Haley. Okay. It takes longer in terms of the written assessment, obviously, if there's something lacking, if there's no output in your answer, if you haven't explained why you've actually carried out a particular procedure designed to address a situation or problem. Okay, one of the letters in STAR is lacking. It will come back to you to actually bolster it in that sense. So that means it can take up to 2 months. The whole point of working with the oak and giving them an opportunity, if you like, a second bite at the cherry, another chance at actually resubmitting the competency, is we don't want to actually fail somebody outright, and that happens very rarely. The other point I'd make in that regard, and this goes back to the fact that it's not an assessment, you need to take your time, okay? Compile your competencies carefully, write the report carefully, okay? Is because if you submit your competency form, say for a CSI, and it's not up to CSI, you will not be given RSI as a consolation prize. I put that in because I've been asked that many, many times. So the name of the game is reflect carefully and take your time. And at that point, I'm going to end. I always put this up at the end because it's actually a slide that's been put together by the Royal Society of Biology that breaks down the 3 registers in terms of cost, level of performance, etc., etc. So I think this is a nice summary of what you, the registrant, will be expected to do and pay when you actually undertake CAP and go for professional registration. And at that point, I'm going to end. Thank you.